I'd like to open the subcommittee meeting to HB 1644. Representative McGee? Excuse me. I'm opening the meeting to the subcommittee of 1644. And before we move further, I'd like to invite Representative Callie Pitts. Could you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance, please? Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, Representative. Welcome, everybody, to a subcommittee meeting, again, HB 1644. Before we get into things, I just want to introduce the members of the subcommittee, which is Representative Nick White, Representative Janine Notter, Representative Kelly Pitts, Representative Partial is a member of subcommittee member who apparently just walked in, and myself. These are the voting members of the subcommittee. Excuse me, Representative McGee, do you have a question? No, you're certainly welcome to be here. You can take your nameplate away so we don't confuse you with a subcommittee member. But you're welcome to stay here, and we may even ask questions, and people, this is the, excuse me. Okay. Let's get down to business here. Obviously, we're here to discuss 1644. You know, there are various options we could do. We could OTP it, OTPA. We could vote for interim study. We could vote to ITL it, and we could also put an amendment in. All those options are on the table, but I would suggest that only one or two of them would really be an option at this time of a practical nature. Representative, do you have a question? Representative?
Can't reach. Yeah, I've been doing a lot of research over the weekend. And the more I read, the more confused I get, including with what we have done in the past, which was we kind of I can't get up there. I need we kind of deregulated the telecommunications industry and gave up our control of it. And I wondered where this bill fits with state regulation, since I believe that we do not have that anymore.
Well, thank you for the question. I don't believe we have that control over this as well. I was going to get into that at a slightly different time. I was going to suggest that maybe we should have a short, brief scientific briefing from Representative White on wavelength or something. I asked you to look into some, just for the general knowledge of everybody, what are we talking about in terms of 5G wavelengths and where they fall into the spectrum, and how they affect or don't affect.
I wish you would have sent me something in writing because I completely forgot. Oh. But Representative Notter's sheets here are actually pretty good summary of everything in terms of frequency, what types of technology are on what frequency, the power levels, things like that. So if there's any specific questions, we can definitely dive into those if anyone has anything.
Representative Notter, would you like to talk to your briefing?
Sure. The technology part of this committee, it doesn't come easy to me. So in order for me to learn, I have to write things out. So I started out with this, just so I can have a visual, like what it all means. I spent a long time on the phone and communication with the scientists to help me to explain everything. And then I took all of that and I figured out that in our legislative email account, we have the ability to create a PowerPoint, which I've never used before. So this was my first one. So if it's not perfect, I apologize. The title page is 5G. What is it? It's an encoding technology, not a frequency, nor the power of the broadcast. The thing being broadcast isn't the problem. The voice versus data makes no difference to the risk of the given signal. If you turn the page, we have 600 megahertz to 900 megahertz, and this is low band. frequency used by all cellular communications since the early 1970s. That's where the channels 14 through 71 for TV reside. Base frequency of all cell phone companies. It goes over mountains and hills. It goes through objects like walls. The old bag cell phones could broadcast at 5 watts. The new handheld cells at 1 watt. TV stations broadcast at 50,000 watts. So you're going to get more radiation driving past the WMUR tower than holding a cell phone to your head for a year, therefore more damaging. If you block 5G in this frequency, you block all cell phones and most TV stations. You turn the page to 1700 megahertz to 2.6 gigahertz. This is mid-band. In this frequency, cell phones broadcast at 0.04 watts. Towers at no more than 5 watts. Wi-Fi is 2.4 gigahertz. A microwave oven is 2.4 gigahertz. Now this has been used mid-band since 1992 with 2G. It's currently used in cities. Without these frequencies, cell service doesn't work in cities. Low band doesn't have enough bandwidth, megahertz, to handle all the users. It goes through walls and through buildings, but at half to a third as well as low band. 2.4 gigahertz, again, that's your microwave oven. Standing in front of it, defrosting a chicken, you're getting more radiation than weeks of using your cell phone. Using these frequencies for cell service instead of cable and satellite equals less radiation received before the FCC converted it to cell phone use. 2.5 gigahertz used to be used for satellites, 150,000 watts in frequency. 1700 to 1900 megahertz was used by the military and scientists. GPS is 2.3 gigahertz. So now we turn the page, we're at 3.2 gigahertz to 3.8 gigahertz. This is microwave. It's currently being set up by Verizon and AT&T. This is what interferes with the planes. Since Sputnik used C-band satellites broadcasting 150,000 watts to over 500,000 watts by Soviets. Parts also used by cable and regular phone companies to broadcast between distant towers before affordable fiber cable TV. That was converted to digital in the 1990s. So the 6-foot plus dishes, you know, that people used to have in their front yards, were in this band at 100,000 times higher power than cell phone services, the same power as 2.5 gigahertz and above. The issue for planes is they're aluminum with miles of thin wire, so that makes the plane a massive antenna, plus interactions between low power, so AC at 60 megahertz, in wires and planes. So the human body is not made of aluminum, and we're not an antenna. And our wires, our nerves, are much better insulated than a plane. We do not oscillate at 60 hertz. It goes through walls poorly. It does not go over hills. It's affected by trees, so even the leaves on the trees will affect it. It works well in cities to add speed, but can't stand alone. So now we turn the page and we're at 5 gigahertz to 7 gigahertz. This is Wi-Fi. We're using it now if you have Wi-Fi. Same power that cell phone company used for mid-bands and microwave. It does not go through walls. This is why it drops going from room to room, which happens to me all the time. Wi-Fi has DFS sections. It requires Wi-Fi access point to listen for radar signals and turn it off and not use those frequencies if they hear anything. Why? Because ground radar uses these frequencies for tracking planes. It's getting very dramatic now, if you hear the cell phone over here, at 100,000 watts of power, 200,000 times more powerful than what you are exposed to with Wi-Fi. So now we turn the page and we have 12 to 60 gigahertz. MM wave. This is the one people say make them sick. It has a higher frequency. All satellite weather mapping is done in 18 gigahertz. 100 to 200,000 watts of power constantly overhead broadcasting down on us. The space station is 12 gigahertz broadcasting down on us. The military uses this frequency. The frequency is so high that even glass will weaken the signal, making it all but useless in a cell phone. They use this in outdoor stadiums. It does not go through walls, so the walls at your house block it. We turn the page at 78 gigahertz. This is your car's collision avoidance system, emergency braking, etc. Frequency at similar power levels to cell service, but constantly. You are being subjected to it constantly every time you drive an older vehicle. Now we turn the page. We have 3,000 gigahertz to 790,000 gigahertz, visible light and ultraviolet light. Visible light is 3,000 gigahertz to 7,650 gigahertz. It's 400 to 1,000 times higher frequency than your car, let alone cell service. Ultraviolet light is 30 petahertz, which I've never heard of before, to 790 terahertz. Again, I've never heard of that. Or 790,000 gigahertz. This is where ionizing radiation begins. All cell phones and other broadcasts are frequencies below visible light, vastly less powerful, vastly less frequency than light from the sun. Visible light can't cause DNA or other ionization. No evidence that anything below visible light can do anything other than warming the skin. So when I hold the cell phone to my ear, my head gets hot and it bothers me. Low voltage versus high voltage. Low voltage electricity is safe to touch, so that's like if you put your tongue on the 9-volt battery, whereas high voltage, like grabbing a power line, will kill you. So the next page talks about ionization. Process of electromagnetic waves being so energetic it can actually break off electrons and atoms from atoms and cause charges to accumulate on the particles that cause them to have energy absorbed that they wouldn't otherwise, and then split apart the molecules that make up the DNA, which is protein chains. To induce ionizing radiation, you have to have both high frequency and high power. That's with really fast wave and above visible light, and it has to be relatively high power levels. None of the frequencies used for cell phones have either the power nor the high frequencies required to do this, as confirmed by countless studies done for over 100 years. On the last page, I just had some end notes. The higher the frequency, the less they penetrate walls and go over hills. Every doubling of frequency effectively halves the ability to penetrate walls and go over hills at the same wattage. 5G poses no more risk than the current use for 4G, and vastly less risk, such as there is any, than when it was being used for military and TV purposes.
Thank you, Representative, for a very comprehensive short-term schooling on frequencies.
I did have some more notes that didn't make it into the presentation.
Oh, I'm
if you want
sorry.
to hear
Go
it.
ahead. You may add.
5G is carried by radio waves transmitted between antenna or mast and your phone. The waves travel shorter distances through urban spaces, so it requires more transmitter mass than previous technology closer to the ground. Radio waves, they're non-ionizing, lack sufficient energy to break apart DNA and cause cellular damage. Higher up the electromagnetic spectrum, well beyond cell phone frequencies, clear health risks from extended exposure. The sun could give you skin cancer. X-rays and gamma rays, didn't have anything with that. 5G uses more transmitters. It runs at lower power levels than 4G, so it equals lower level of radiation. Part of the 5G spectrum falls under microwave band, generates heat in objects through which they pass. Maximum radio frequency level is so small, no temperature rise has been observed to date. And that's from Professor Rodney Croft, the advisor to the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection. Now I'm done.
Thank you, Representative Notter. Does anyone on this subcommittee have any questions for the representative in terms of her briefing? Does anyone, at this point, I'd like to open to our visitors to see if they have any more to add in that information. We'll get to counterpoints in a minute. I just want to make sure that what was briefed is understood by all and is, I'm sure it's accurate, but is there anything else that they could add to it? 1 minute, please. Representative Kelly Pitts, do you have a question?
Well, you're talking about adding to the presentation, and I made some notes as I was going along on the presentation. So
Go ahead.
You want, well,
Sure.
a couple of things.
Open discussion.
A couple of things that I made notes on is that if you block the 5G, you block all cell phones and most TV stations. And in my research, I found that not to be true. that some of the older cell phones will not work, and that's something that we haven't heard, and that people would have to check to see what kind of, how many gigahertz your phone works on. I'd be darned if I could find out what my phone works on. Probably hot air. But that did not seem to be correct from the information that I had gleaned. There is such a thing as, and has been studied as radiation sensitivity. And I remember the studies that came out years ago that caution people about holding the cell phones too close to your head. And this is going on to 4G and 3G, because there was a correlation between cell phones, people who constantly use a cell phone, and brain tumors. And that was a study that was ongoing. And I do believe that they're still ongoing, even though it's being rolled out. About the human body not being an antenna. I don't know. When I was a kid, it was hold the rabbit ears and we get reception and we can get it. So I think the human body certainly is a conductor of electricity and can do that. And I was used as an antenna as a child. And a couple of other things. You were subject to constantly, every time you drove, there's radiation all around us. We know that. Our own friendly sun has radiation, and yes, the sun will burn you. But then there are effects that some people have, not all people, that are sensitive, that can be gleaned from just the normal everyday radiation. And one of the factors in radiation in general is radon, and we're told to test. It's recommended that when you buy a house, you check it for radon and also your well. So there's so many things in my mind here that added to what we're talking about. And the other one was the distance from the source. Now, we talked about the space station. The distance from the source makes the effects less. So I'm certainly not reaching out to the space station or trying to touch it. I can't even touch the light bulb in my house. So those are the things that I found interesting, and there are implications, and there are studies. And what I found is that some of this is not 100% because none of the scientists seem to be 100% with the information. So that's my little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative. And I would agree, there's a lot of unsettledness in this technology right now, probably for some time to come. I think it's important that we, as a subcommittee, understand the background and the, excuse me, the wide variety of the radiation that's around us. I believe, for the purpose of this bill, I think what we're focusing on, or what we should focus on, is not so much whether you can hold your phone to your ear or not, but it's the any frequencies coming from the actual towers that are providing this medium to whatever instruments has used 5G. So while I think it's very important that we do understand this background, excellent presentation, Representative Nodder, questions, Representative Kelly-Pitts, we need to understand all that background so we can go forward and look at the real specificness of tower and how it could be interfering. Before I go on to another question, is my understanding, reading, I went to the frequently asked questions of the FCC online, provided very good information. It's my understanding, though, and also reading from the CITA presentation, that the technology of 5G, the 5.7 to 5.9 gigahertz, I understand becomes ineffective after 1,000 feet, is what I heard was being briefed by the CTIA. So anything beyond 1,000 feet would, I'm assuming, would render the 5G technology useless for what they have to use it for. So that's just what I read there. I'm not going to demote you to sergeant. Representative Partial.
Thank you so much, Representative Thomas. And thank you for the paper that you sent along from the European, I can't remember the,
It's a long acronym.
it is, and I'm horrible with acronyms.
I
so
see
forgive
too
me.
many letters, yeah.
Yeah, which warns me that my very own pride and joy in my kitchen, my induction cooktop, is something that I should be avoiding. The difference there is I take that risk on, and what we're talking about here is we're imposing a risk on the broad public. And my other question, and this is something that I've had in my back of my mind since this bill was first introduced. If this technology is indeed questionable enough and potentially dangerous enough to require setbacks, then why are we employing it at all when we know that we have a job only half done with 4G technology, and we have very many dead spots in our state, is always irritating to discover. I'm thinking that with the limitations of 5G and its unfulfilled promise, we may be more wiser to thus put the whole thing on the back burner and focus on 4G technology and continue that, finishing that task. However, I also do understand that we do have to cede a certain amount of authority to the FCC. And lastly, I know I'm going on there, please forgive me. I know the FCC does tend to carry a lot of, well, let's say, well, I don't know how to say this. The chairs of the FCC are recruited from lobbyists rather than the scientific community. And I got to say that I am concerned about that. I'm concerned that we maybe are not getting the best knowledge that we really require to make such a decision. I feel undereducated, I will say. So, and thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Representative. I will say that I think you were referring to the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection. They're an international body, and my understanding is that the U.S. does look at them for specifications as well. My understanding, reading some of the literature here, that we even go beyond what they recommend for the specs. I'll put it simply. They talk in terms of, power and amplitude and amperes and so forth. But I will state that just about every body, be it WHO or this body here or other health organizations, they classify just about everything in terms of what kind of a carcinogenic effect it would have on people. And according to what I read, the World Health Organization classifies this frequency, this technology, as a Class 2B carcinogen, or however you pronounce it correctly. Yeah, great. Now, that may worry some people, but I discovered that many things are classified, whether they're low or high, and this is considered low level. In fact, the use of talcum powder is put into the same category as 2B. So and I believe that's because no one can ever prove conclusively that it does or doesn't, but evidence supports low level and possible. So what's the risk factor, low versus high? I think that's why they have it in that category. Although I do recognize that, some people do have effects from this. I mean, there's no question about it. People have effects. People have, I don't want to compare this to allergens, but in a similar way, you can be more sensitive to one allergy versus another, and it's hell for some people. I understand that. That's my thing. Anyway, Representative Callie Pitts.
I'll say talcum powder, the jury's out. The awards have been made.
Yeah.
But I want to just say that there was another issue that, as far as rolling out 5G, I couldn't get an answer as to whether the money coming from the federal government would be used to roll out 5G exclusively. And the other was the companies behind it. Now, I know AT&T, Verizon, they have their moniker on it. But who's the company behind it? And there was some question about one of the companies that is rolling out 5G, and that company has been banned in certain places because of security reasons, and they're the ones behind the research and that are doing this. So that was another thing that kind of put a little dent in my brain and said, wait a minute, if other countries are doing this, maybe we need to find out why, and I don't want to mention the name of the company, but I believe Hawaii has banned 5G and other companies because of the involvement with this particular company. So I don't know, and we have no control over that. We have ceded that authority. So I just don't know about this 5G. And also the warning to the people that your phone may not work. You may not be able to make a 911 call, and that scared me, because even if you have a dead line in your house, if there's nobody living there and you have what was a landline, you could be able to plug into that line, or it used to be that you could make a 911 call. You couldn't call anything else, but you could call 911. So if your cell phone is disabled, if you have an older cell phone like I do, you may not be able to make a 911 call in an emergency. So there's a lot of implications. And the one thing that really sparked my interest, because all of this, I said, well, it's going to happen and we'll be up to 10G by the time I'm dead, was what the FAA, the problems the FAA had, and saying, well, wait a minute, this radiation that nothing can get through, in this report, can affect the altimeters in planes. Makes me a little bit worried, and that they're now going to have perimeters around airports. So that worried me too. So if it can affect an airplane like that, how could it affect me?
Well, I thank you for that. And I would add, though, that from my reading, the FAA is concerned about it rolling out, but I don't believe it's because of the actual what the effects of the wavelength would cause. It's more because of the narrowness of the bandwidth that lies between the bandwidth they use for the altimeter settings on the airplanes and the 5G technology. Now, my understanding between 5.7 and 5.9 is where the new 5G technology falls within. My understanding is that there is only a 0.3 gigahertz separation between the bands, and that, to me, coming and having working for 29 years in the communications area for acquisitions, that's a very narrow band for possible bleed over, and if you don't have good insulation on some of these older planes, that there's a chance that it could bleed over and affect the altimeter reading, particularly during landing at low levels. I believe that's what the FAA is concerned about. That's a different issue than what we're discussing here, though. It was a concern of mine, but that's more of a bandwidth separation issue. I think here we are also interested in the health, how it affects organic people. Well, all people are organic. Some people may not be organic, but most of them are. But how it affects people. And so I rely on a lot of reports that are being put out. The world, which we know the rest of the world, Europe and particularly Australia, are probably the first ones to put any mandates up on anything that they don't think is safe or good. And they haven't yet. They have done studies on this, and they claim that it's safe. But safe is a relative term, I understand. I cannot deny that some people are very sensitive to this type of frequency at any bandwidth, from radio to TV, even near airports with radar, and they can be affected just like someone could be effective living in a forest versus urbanness, or being affected in other ways. There certainly seems to be a correlation. I don't see a whole lot of evidence right now where there's a causation, which is a major factor. But I'm getting off track here just a little bit. Representative Kelly Pitts, you brought up about the 911. Since you brought that up, I would like, I believe there's a gentleman here from the Department of Safety. I'm sorry, sir, what was your name again? Mark Doyle. He may want to speak briefly about the safety factor involving 911 and other things. If you would, occur, how would this bill affect that?
Certainly. Good morning, Representative Kelly. My name's Mark Doyle.
Turn the mic on.
I still have to get used to this. Thank you for
inviting me, Representative Thomas, to speak to that narrowly focused issue Representative Callie Pitts brought up. My name is Mark Doyle. I'm the Director of the Division of Emergency Services and Communications, overseeing 911 with the Department of Safety. You spoke to older cell phones and the technology associated with older cell phones on the 3G frequency bandwidth, and there are a lot of companies. I know that T-Mobile, Sprint, AT&T, and Verizon are all phasing out their 3G networks this year, part and parcel to accommodate more space and network allocation and bandwidth toward the 5G rollout. Long story short, what's going to happen with folks that have those 3G capable cell phones right now is they will not be able to communicate at all, even for the purpose of contacting 911. Many folks had and hung on to a lot of those, what we would call decommissioned or inactive cell phones, because they never had a subscription plan associated with them, but they were kicking around at people's desks and whatnot, and they would give them to their children because they still always had 911 capability associated with them, meaning that even though they didn't have a subscription service, you could still dial 911. Every cell phone is like that, by the way. The problem associated with the older 3G network is once the 3G network goes away, that capability goes away with it as well. So we've been trying to do our due diligence to message out to folks that if you have an older 3G phone, 3G capable phone, and it's on the 3G network, to make sure you connect with your cellular digital network, whomever that carrier might be, that telecom or that LTE carrier, so that you can find out if your phone's affected, if it's only a 3G phone, and what you need to do to go ahead and update that subscription so you can get a phone that's capable of dialing 911 either through the current 4G system or the scaling out of the 5G network. Thank you for that question.
Representative Callie Pitts?
Thank you for talking to that, speaking to that. In some of the literature I read, for 3G, it was also 4G, which is a more modern, I would think, phone. And I know the government's going to do something to replace them or whatever, but still, in an emergency, to cripple that phone seems to me to be a little bit, a little bit over the top. And I helped put in the 911 network. That's how old I am. So I appreciate that people could have to buy another phone or whatever. But that seems a little bit, it's scary to me that somebody needs to reach out and call 911 and can't. So, and not everybody's going to get that message. I didn't have it until I started digging through the research. So how do we deal with that particular thing? And is that going to be, do you know if that's going to be everywhere or just in proximity of these towers?
And thank you for the question. It's actually a very good question. My understanding is when it comes to the impact on 4G is I've not heard any of that in any of the industry news that's been pushed out. Again, it's only the 3G capable cell phones that are going to be impacted and affected. So to your point, how do we make sure that we get the message out relative to that issue impacting folks that have the 3G phones still? And I understand there are probably thousands or tens of thousands of these still kicking around, whether they're being used actively or whether they're in people's drawers at home that they've been having for years and just never really activated and have no subscription service. We've got to do our due diligence to assist the telecoms, the telecommunications carriers, the LTE network provisioners, and assist in getting that message to all the folks in the state. And it's not just to the state of New Hampshire. It's not just to those telecommunication carriers. I mean, this is something that's come down from our own industry at 911, as well as through the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, to let folks know that this is happening. What I have heard anecdotally is that a lot of the carriers have sent messages out through the mail or otherwise to the folks that subscribe to those services right now, letting them know what the end of life is for their 3G capable phone. I think Verizon has theirs, and their deadline is the end of this year. I believe Sprint and T-Mobile are coming up in May and June respectively, and I think AT&T is starting their phasing out as early as February. So it's important that everybody does their their best effort to make sure that people are aware that those phones are going to go by the wayside and the capabilities associated with them are going to cease.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Does anyone have, thank you, Ms. Doyle. If you're standing by here for the rest of the meeting, it'd be great if some questions come. You're certainly welcome to stay.
And thank you for the invite, Representative Thomas. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Before we move on, before we move on, is there anyone here that represents CTIA or the industry at all? I'm looking at the testimony from Beth Ann Cooley from CTIA. And at one point here, they say that, and I'll read this quote, it says, let's see, acting responsibly, scientists, engineers continue to research RF exposure, including RF exposure with 5G technology. For example, studies have shown that 5G communication, which will take advantage of small cell network architecture, rests in more base stations operating at lower point power levels. Goes on to say that further, a recent study demonstrated that 5G antenna densification does not increase the level of exposure, in contrast to a very popular belief. On the contrary, antenna densification does not change the exposure levels for the majority of the population, while at base station proximity, a huge radiation decrease is experienced when more base stations are deployed in the same territory. I was hoping if anyone here could maybe speak to that or have any knowledge on that, if you could. Sure. Representative Otter?
I don't. I have a stack of the testimony that we heard, and it's just down the hall. I'm just going to run and get it. So
Okay, go ahead. Yes, state your name and who you represent.
Hi, I'm Kent Chamberlain, and I'm from Durham, New Hampshire, and I served on the commission. We have two other people who served on the commission behind me, so...
Closer to the mic, please.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. But before I start, I should say that I tell a little bit about who I am, because this seems to be a contentious issue. Not contentious because the science isn't clear, but it's contentious because there's a lot at stake, in particular money-wise. So I'm Kent Chamberlain.
Closer.
Okay.
Just closer.
And before I joined the commission, and while I served on the commission, I was chair of the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of New Hampshire. And the reason I was asked to serve on the commission was because of my background in electromagnetics and radio frequency engineering. So I've got a lot of experience with the questions and the comments that were made earlier, and I can certainly address them. But what I'd like to start off with, and I also should mention, is that I've come out of the ivory tower many, many times in my 40-year career. I've worked with 25 research sponsors from industry and government agencies. In fact, I worked on what's called Project 54 that deals with first responders and make sure that they have the communications they need. So I'm very sensitive to not only the needs of industry, but also the needs of first responders and people who need to communicate via things like 911. So I'm coming to you now as a citizen. I'm unpaid for what I do, so I don't have any vested interest in what I'm going to tell you today. I think a starting point would be to say that, you talked a lot about frequencies, and this is something, of course, we looked at on the commission. Remember, the commission met on a regular basis throughout the year, and we did a lot of studying on our own. And so some things, and this discussion of frequencies came up very early on. And the bottom line for that is that we found that the frequencies, all the frequencies that you named for digital communication are harmful. Now, it's very likely that some frequencies are going to be more harmful than others, but it's really, the research done so far has not parsed that out. So all of the frequencies that are used for digital communication, starting with 500 megahertz on up, do have adverse physiological effects, and they've been very thoroughly documented in the literature. So that's the first point I want to make. We also found, as you can probably tell, for those of you who have looked at the conclusions of our final report, we found that exposure to radiation does cause significant harm. And this is cell phone type radiation.
So we've looked at the epidemiology. In fact, it's pretty clear, and I don't know why. A link was sent to you about a video that we came up with our rationale for setting a 500-meter setback. And the reason is and we can do this several ways. One is you can look at people living near cell towers and find out how their health, adverse health effects for those people, and then plot that as a function of the distance they live from the cell towers. Now, that's been done in 10 studies. And in 8 of the 10 of those studies, it showed that at about 500 meters, you're going to start not seeing adverse effects from living near a cell tower. So the fact that I can even talk about that to begin with, the fact that mortality rates drop off when you look at people, the distance people live from a cell tower, that in itself is a good indication, a strong indication that, that living near a cell tower isn't good for you. And that is the focus of our legislation, the legislation being proposed. If you have a cell tower right in your backyard, you're far more likely to die of things like cancer, but there are many other things too. Cancer is just one issue. What happens when you're exposed to radiation, the type of radiation that we're talking about, cell phone type radiation, is that there is what's referred to as oxidative radiation. So what was talked about earlier was ionizing radiation, and that's where the photons, the individual photons, have enough energy to knock electrons off of atoms and cause mutations. We know about that. That's what causes things like skin cancer. I know firsthand about that. I had to go to the dermatologist to get some of that burned off. So we know about that, and we've known about it for a long time. But what seems to be somewhat newer is the fact that it's radiation, like the radiation you get from your cell phone, causes oxidative radiation. Oxidative, you've heard these terms before, free radicals. That comes from oxidizing radiation. That's why we eat antioxidant foods and take supplements to lower our oxidation, is that we don't want those free radicals in our body. And that's exactly what cell phone radiation, cell phone type radiation, wireless radiation does to your body. So what we found is that if you move away from the transmitter, and remember, this only pertains to future installations, but if you're at 500 meters or more from a cell phone transmitter, you're less likely, or it's very likely that you won't experience any adverse health effects at all. So that is the basic finding, the science. So I mentioned that we did it by looking at the epidemiology first. That is, look at the health outcomes of people living near towers. We also looked at what the outcomes were in laboratory experiments. So in the laboratory, you can very carefully adjust what the exposure levels are for whatever it is that you're studying, and find out, set kind of a lower level where you say that below this level, adverse effects don't happen. So we identified what that signal level was, and then found out how far from a typical cell tower you would have to go to achieve that level of radiation. Turns out that both ways of making this calculation came up with the same basic result. They weren't exact, but they were very, very close. And that is 500 meters or 1,640 feet. So we have a very solid rationale, scientific-based rationale for saying you shouldn't put towers closer than 1,640 feet from places where people live, work, and recreate. So by doing that, by following what is asked for in this legislation, we will go a long way in protecting the people of New Hampshire from a type of exposure that can be pretty severe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question before Representative McGee. So where I was reading where the 5G technology, I hate to use 5G because I know that's not frequency, but the 5G technology I read becomes ineffective at around 1,000 feet. Now, it begs the question, do you mean it's ineffective in terms of being able to be useful for communications, or does it mean ineffective in terms of it has no effect on anybody or anything? I don't know anyone here that can answer that question. But if that being the case, and we were to put this at 500 meters, you would effectively shut down all of that type of communication in those areas, and particularly around hospitals and businesses that rely heavily on faster data. Would that not be correct?
There are a few things that should be mentioned here. One is that 5G is more or less a marketing term.
Yeah.
There is no recipe for 5G. And in fact, there are a lot of 5G transmitters that do have nothing to do with the higher frequencies. They're using the same frequencies as 4G. And that's one reason that we didn't make an exclusion for only the higher frequencies. That's something that could be looked at later. But what you could conceivably do if we made that exception for 5G now is simply move essentially the 4G towers, put them into these little small cells and radiate at the same level as they're radiating now, which would cause greater exposure. There's another statement that I'd like to make, and that involves 5G, and it's something that was said earlier, is the claim that radiation levels go down when you put in 5G, and that's not the case. 5G piggybacks on top of 4G. So when you add 5G, you add to the total radiation. And this has been shown in cities where 5G has been installed. There are studies that go on where people measure the radiation level in various cities. This is an ongoing effort, and I can give you links to that. So when you go to a city that has 4G only and below, you're going to have certain radiation levels as you move through the city. But when you go to a city that has 5G installed, your radiation levels go up. And what we discovered on the commission is that radiation is like smog, if you will, like air pollution, that you have background levels, and at certain points they start rising, and people start getting sick from it. And that's why some people who aren't electrohypersensitive now become electrohypersensitive as they're exposed to increasing levels of background radiation.
Thank you. I'll allow myself one follow-up before moving on. I think the quote that I read previous to you coming on and talked in terms of densification, which I believe it's as you put more antennas together, your overall effects might go down. I will say that from my experience, working a bit in the military acquisition field, there was a lot of concern when you put too many antennas together that their overall effects go down because there's a lot of interference and scatter, and so the effects go down. Would that not be the same type of technology in this way? If you put too many antennas together, that you actually decrease their power?
That flies in the face of the physics that I know, and that is that it's at times there will be cancellation, certainly, but at other times there's going to be reinforcement. So you're going to have a signal now that varies rapidly and hugely. In the final analysis, the total exposure is going to be the sum of all transmitters, of all radiation sources.
Okay. Representative McGee?
Thank you. And thank you for taking my question. As I've been listening to the information that's being presented in terms of the amount of radiation that's being emitted that we're discussing, we've got megahertz and also gigahertz, and those are two very different things in terms of amounts. Mm-hmm. And when I just heard you say that we have used the science in order to determine a calculation of what would be a safe distance, I'm wondering what level of hertz you are applying to the technology so that we could maybe understand how these equations were calculated.
Absolutely, and I can go through them with you right now. But like I said, it's not the hertz. As long as we're talking about digital radiation, 600 megahertz and above, it seems, the evidence shows that they are all harmful. But what matters is the exposure level, and that would be the milliwatts or watts per meter squared. So you have a radiation source, or you could even consider a light bulb. It's radiating down, and so how much energy is coming out of that light bulb, or how much of that is striking me? It's going to be the watts per area multiplied times the area that's being exposed. So it's the radiation level or the power level that determines what's harmful, and that's what we're finding. So I can give you numbers. We're thinking that the lower limit would be 500 microwatts per meter squared. Now, there are some people who will still be affected by that, the people who are electrohypersensitive. And by the way, that is a real thing. It's recognized by the Americans with Disabilities Act and by Medicare. So it's a real thing. And so people that are electrosensitive at 500 microwatts per meter squared, they're still going to be feeling it. So our legislation, the proposed legislation, won't protect everybody, absolutely, but it will make them, provide them with some protection against the more severe effects that might occur at higher exposure levels.
Thank you.
Representative White?
So you mentioned a second ago about Americans, there's a law that recognizes these. What is there in terms of research, though, that recognizes these disabilities, people that are more sensitive to electromagnetic radiation and things like that?
I'm thinking the work by Martin Paul. I mean, there is a whole trove of information, and maybe this is something, if you don't mind, I'd like to say about the commission, is where we got our information that would answer a question like the one you're asking right now. One of my jobs on the commission was to look at the quality of journals that were being used to provide our information. You'll hear from the telecommunications industry, and remember, they don't like our pronouncement that there is harm in radiation exposure. So what they have claimed is that all articles that show harm from radiation exposure are from what they call fringe journals, and they are cherry-picked. And that's absolutely not true. And so one of my jobs on the commission was to look at that and evaluate whether or not there were fringe journals. And the reason I was picked for that job is because I am a former associate editor for IEEE Transactions on Attendance and Propagation. So it's a major scientific publication, and I was an associate editor. So I was given that task, is to look at the articles that showed harm and determine if they were from quality journals. And I can just tell you shortly, in short terms now, that yes, absolutely, highly credible journals with the editors, the authors of the journals, the reviewers, were all from recognized universities. And so the information was rock solid. So there are many articles that do show the adverse effects that I'm talking about right now. And those are what we looked at. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of articles showing that from reputable journals. So yeah, this is not something new, showing that the harm that's recognized and has been recognized by the ADA for a while, it is well known in the science. Did I answer your question?
I think so. Thank you.
Representative Kelly Pitts?
Can you tell me, is the report from the commission, the complete report, available anywhere?
Yes, it's online.
On-
Representative Abrami didn't feel like he should hand out the 400
Representative Kelly
pages.
Pitts?
But
It's right here.
on what website?
Mr. Chair.
Jackie?
Mr. Chair.
Jackie?
That's not a 400-page report.
Mr. Chair.
I would really, Mr. Chair, I would really like, I mean, in lieu that we don't have a phone book to read anymore, I really would like to read the report and see if I can make more heads and tails of it and see, again, your sources and look at that. So no objection to going online. Of course, I don't have 5G, so it'll take me 4 days. But I just would like to know what website that's available on.
Yes, Representative Abrami.
We'll send a link to it. This is the beginning part of the report. The report's 390 pages long, created by a commission in New Hampshire. A lot of that's minutes, a lot of that's all the references that Dr. Chamberlain is talking about. We have thousands of references from science. You should be talking in the mic. So, but, well, it's in the report. When you have a committee-
Abrami, if you're going to speak a long time, would you go to the mic, please?
I'll share.
Yeah. Go ahead. So,
Yeah, the
sorry,
commission-
I thought you had a brief statement. But
No,
instead of
that's what I
talking,
did too.
please,
I guess I can't help myself. We spent a lot of time on this as a commission, 14 months. We've accumulated thousands of papers, as Dr. Chamberlain is talking about, that are all referenced in the report, in the appendices of the report. And matter of fact, in the body of the report, they are linked. If you get the report, you can, when we talk about something, we link it to specific papers that relate to it. So, but for a committee like this, it's an overwhelming task to go through all of the science we did. And I'm just saying, we did the homework for this moment. We did the homework for this kind of a bill to be brought forward. And, you know, it was very difficult in the initial meeting to express all that we know. We appreciate the time today, because it's giving us a chance to, in a more informal setting, to try to get through some of the signs to you. And as I step down from here, I'd like to bring Ken Wells to sit next to him, because, and you all know Ken from being a science and tech guy, and Ken was on the commission as well, but he's got a background in physics as well. So we got the two physics guys here that could shed some light on this.
Yeah, Representative Kelly Pitts?
I need a follow-up. I asked a very simple question. Where can I reference this report? Can you give me a website?
I'm going to send I'm going to send a link to the I don't have it. It's a long link, so I will send a link to the chair, or to the
committee
I'll
would
send
be
a link
nice.
to I'll send a link to you and the rest of the committee as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I do have a question, I guess for anyone that was on the commission. I understand that there was a minority report on that commission report. Is there anyone here that could speak to the minority report at all?
Not that I see. Let me explain the minority report. And that's the way commissions work. When I filed a bill to create the 5G commission, so I said, well, let's have the people from the industry. So CTIA, who you're referencing, Beth Cooley, who is the lobbyist. I wanted a scientist. I wanted a scientist from the CTIA to be on the committee, but there wasn't. So I thought we would have a dialogue in this committee, probably naively, thinking that we could come to some terms as to the issue. So she was in a minority. Of course she was going to be in a minority. She's representing the industry. Then we had, I also requested that the BIA find me a scientist, Business Industry Association of New Hampshire. And they couldn't find a scientist. So, because we have a lot of high-tech companies here, I wanted somebody with background in radio frequency and all that. And so Dave Gervais, who most of us know, so I can't find anybody, but I'll sit on it. But I mean, after the first meeting, Dave, poor Dave, you know, because we really got into the science, and his eyes were rolling, you know, like, wow. But Dave never came to the meetings until the very end, and was one of the two in the minority report. And then, of course, there was Senator Gray, who had some legitimate arguments, but those were the three people who voted for the minority report. Two of them, you know, and Dave basically represents businesses who don't understand the detail of this, don't understand the science of this. And, you know, I love Dave. I mean, I work with Dave all the time, so I'm not, there's no disparaging mark, but and again, we're here to say that the science is there. We're trying to find a way of taking a first step by this bill to do something. We'd love to work with the Science and Tech Committee here to if this is in the bill that you like, that we create some kind of a subcommittee of this group to continue looking at this. I can bring in experts of science like Dr. Chamberlain, high quality people who understand this. Again, it took me a while to figure this out too. I'm an engineer, but you know, we brought in a lot of experts into this committee from around the country, and this is this is not just New Hampshire, and you know, all eyes are on this. You all got hundreds of emails from around the country and around the world on this topic because no one's listening. No one's listening. Someone mentioned that the FCC is a captive agency. Absolutely, no question. Everybody in the FCC came from the industry. Their job isn't science. Their job is to allocate bandwidth. That's what they do. They allocate bandwidth. But they rely on the FDA. But the FDA doesn't do much of their own science. They may review some papers, whatever. But we, as a commission, little New Hampshire, tried to get the FCC, tried to get the FDA to answer our questions, our specific questions. And this refers to a website. Oh, good. We had very specific questions. Show us the science that you have that says this isn't harmful. Show us the science. And we got, then we even tried the Environmental Protection Agency. They used to have a role years ago, before 1996, before the Telecommunication Act of 1996. And when we reached out to them, they said, not our job. We don't have any funding for this, not our mission. But they're probably the most equipped to really weigh in on this. So, I know this bill is really putting a lot on your shoulders here. And I'm saying, okay, maybe we pass this bill, maybe we don't pass this bill, but I don't want this dialogue to die. I think we need to somehow craft something that we can keep this going, and it's an important topic. And again, I'm not the kind of guy that is, a warrior when it comes to these kind of most things. I'm not the guy out there doing this. But after I learned, and I sat through the commission for 14 months, I said, wow, there's something here. And so those are some of my thoughts. And I do wish you heard from former Representative Wells as well, because he has some interesting insights as well to share with you today.
Okay. Question, Representative Notter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Representative. This is really difficult because, like you said, we got emails from everywhere, from all over, and there's always two sides to every story. So we hear from some scientists that say people are getting sick and it's bad, we got to stop this. Other scientists are saying that it's inconclusive and you can't prove it. And my thoughts are all going haywire. Well, earlier when the chairman was talking about talcum powder, it reminded me of a workshop I went to about the toxic world we live in. There's toxins everywhere. There's chemicals in everything. It's in our food. It's in mattresses. It's in carpets. It's in our clothing. It's like people are hypersensitive. I mean, how far do we go? We are sympathetic to people that are hypersensitive to everything, and we can't say with absolute certainty that the technology is what's making them sick. The jury's still out on that because there's always conflicting science. But one thing we do know, and that we cannot forget, is that the industry is never going to support the passage of this bill, and it's going to halt future investments in New Hampshire. So it's very, very difficult to hear all this.
I don't think they're going to abandon this market. Again, all we're asking for is that I think in my opening comments in the hearing was simple. I said, we all love our cell phones. We all want them. But do we need to watch a full-length movie while we're walking down the street? I mean, that's what we're talking about. I mean, we're all for safe science, and that's all we're talking about. And by the way, let's not confuse broadband. There's some confusion with this. Broadband is, we're all for optical cable, optical, but yes, it's a small part of the whole discussion of this, but it's not, what we're doing in that front is a whole another story as well.
Representative Parson.
Thank you again, Representative Notter, and thank you for submitting this bill. You just mentioned broadband, and that just piqued my interest because I just became familiar with a term called mobile broadband, which they're claiming speeds with F5 up to 50 megabytes per second. However, an article from last year in the Washington Post said that the actual speeds that one can expect are far lower than that. I've seen nothing to contradict that. So again, I mean, I would love to see us be able to have driverless cars and all that at some future point. Right now, I got stranded in Nelson a couple weeks back because my electric car died. And I could not call my garage because I could not get cell coverage. I'm just, again, I mean, I don't see this as the end of cellular technology if we do not incorporate 5G, but if I'm wrong, please correct me. And another question that you had earlier about two questions, CTIA. The claim that radiation emissions will not be any greater with a higher density. Is it equivalent of building more swimming pools and saying that, let me say this, we can build more swimming pools and cluster them closer together. And one swimming pool may not affect the quality of water in another swimming pool, but children are going to get wetter. I mean, is that a workable analogy? What do you think?
Dr. Chamberlain.
Actually, I'm not sure how to answer that one, but just the more, let's put it this way, instead of swimming pools, let's call it smokers. If one of us were in this room smoking, we would have a level of toxin, of pollution. But if we were all smoking, chain smoking, that level would come up. So the more smokers there are, the more radiation sources there are, the more sources of pollution will affect us and have negative effects on us. Was that a fair analogy?
From what you're saying, I would ask again, if the person from CTIA was here, I would ask her if she could explain it another way then, because it sounds like it, and it does answer my question though, yes.
So,
one more question, then I'll be done.
If I may
Sure.
ask a same question in a different manner. From what I was reading, I'm not sure if they meant that the effects would be any less or more, but I think it was talking in terms of power. Is it possible that if you combine several antennas closer together, that they wouldn't need as much power to have coverage as they would if they had lesser antennas? Is that a fair question?
I think it's a fair question, and I can see where if you have distributed antennas, yes, you could then use lower power total. There are a lot of caveats here. It's how you implement it. But if you had one that was only transmitting when there was somebody that was communicating with that particular tower, I could see that would be the case. But please keep in mind that where they've made the measurements, that hasn't been the reality. Where they've made measurements, places with 5G have a higher background radiation than those places that don't have 5G. So I've heard some of these arguments, but they don't really make sense. And there's one other issue that I wanted to address, and that was somebody talking about coverage area. And remember that a lot of my career has been spent modeling propagation. Where can you get signals if you put a tower here, here, or here? So you can provide coverage. So if you're stranded in your car, that's because there wasn't a tower nearby, obviously. And it's a question of what markets the cell industry wants to maintain and where they want to put antennas. As a radio frequency engineer, somebody who's modeled electromagnetics, I can tell you, you can do it. It's a function of cost. It may cost you more to put in that tall tower that gives you that broader coverage area and provides lower exposure to individuals. But it can be done, and it's just a matter of cost in most cases.
I'm sorry, Representative Parshall, you could ask your follow-on question, but before that, I would advise you to carry a power pack with you in your car wherever you go, just in case.
You know, we all make mistakes, and I made a big one on that one. I'm not ashamed to admit it. I don't have this information at hand, but I've heard that the current commission at the FCC, the 5 appointed commissioner, well, I guess one is vacant now, but the 4 seats, equally Democrat and Republican, they all are drawn from CTIA background and where they have served as lobbyists within that industry. I don't know if that's true or not. Do you have any information on that?
Don't have the current information, but I suggest that people look at the Harvard report, and you can find that Harvard report by Googling Harvard, FCC, and captured. And they go through exactly who's been serving and when. And that is the case. And they equate what's going on with the telecommunications industry now and cell phone exposure, they equate that to the tobacco industry. Is that, of course, tobacco, probably some of them still claim it doesn't cause cancer, but it seems like the telecommunications industry is following that playbook, and that's according to this Harvard report. So yeah, a lot of the people running the FCC are from industry.
Thank you. Representative Kelly Pitts.
I want to follow up on something. Since we were doing swimming pools, it brought my mind to pigs. You said that 5G piggybacks on 4G. So if you don't roll out the 5G as comprehensively as they want to do it, would it stop or would it inhibit eliminating dead zones in New Hampshire? If we stop that, would we then cause a problem or exacerbate a problem with quote-unquote dead spots?
So I'm sorry, if we turned off 5G?
If we stopped the rollout or somehow inhibited the rollout of 5G, would that inhibit us or stop us from answering the problem of dead zones and dead spots in the state of New Hampshire?
So, I mean, my answer would be no. You would have to, I mean, assuming that you would use 4G technology to fill in those gaps, no, that wouldn't be a problem. By the way, 5G is mostly for data. 4G, 3G is for telecommunications, talking to people.
Any more questions for these two gentlemen before we go to the Honorable Wells? Representative Nodder.
Have any other states banned 5G?
Okay, this is what's going on in the country. Communities are trying to do something about it. But it's a hard battle, trying to, through ordinances, to try to limit where the antennas are. Not ban it, but limit it. Again, let's backtrack one thing. 5G is a concept we talked about, a marketing concept. Each one of the companies has their own strategy. Now, what the new wrinkle was millimeter waves. Okay, we went further up the spectrum. But as the chair mentioned, millimeter waves don't travel very far. So by about 1,000, maybe 1,000 feet or something like that. So if we go 5G in that route using small cell antennas, those antennas would have to be spaced every 200 yards on telephone poles in front of your house. That's what got me going. So I said to myself, do I really want one of those in front of my house? Probably not. But we're powerless because of the 1996 Act. I say to myself, forget about the health, forget about all that. I mean, we as Americans are beholden to a 1996 Act and standards that have not changed since 1996. They just re-upped their standards in 2019. And guess what? The Joe Kennedy's group, Children's Defense, and the Environmental Health Trust, both sued. And I mentioned this in my presentation. And the Court of Appeals in D.C. Circuit said that the FCC's reissuing of the same standards was arbitrary and capricious. They did not review the science. And that's what the court said. And that's something, to me, was a big flag. Maybe we're onto something here. This came out last summer or last August. Now, where the Court of Appeals are weighing in on a federal agency not doing what they were supposed to do in publishing regulations. But understand that those standards have not changed. And someone had mentioned about power density. Yeah, we talked about power. And it really is ultimately about power density coming out of the antennas. And we considered that in the commission, saying, well, maybe we could say, you know, let's measure the power densities around, because who's testing all this stuff? Nobody. That's the problem. Who's overseeing this stuff? Surely not the federal government. Do you see trucks out there measuring? No. Do you see the state? We're not measuring. So that's the number of the thing. But our country has the highest standards in reverse, really the lowest standards. I mean, the highest number, I forget the number now.
10 watts per meter squared.
10 watts per meter squared, thank you, as acceptable. Other developed countries don't have that. They're much lower standards. And why is that? You know, it's like, we can go country to country. Even countries like India have lower standards, and Russia have lower standards. But yes, power density. We said, well, one of the things we had talked about in the commission is, well, why don't we just establish that we would measure, the state would measure, you know, each around different areas as to what the densities are of the RF radiation, the amounts. Understand that there's a compounding effect depending on where these antennas are of this radiation. There's all sorts of stuff that we talked about in the you know, we talked about the modulating issues. We talked about the cone, what's that called? The cone. But there's yeah, the patterns and the pulse signals, that these are pulsing waves. They're not continuous waves. They pulse. When they're pulsing, they're at higher intensity. So it's all the stuff that's out there that we need to get our arms around. So we chose to go with the distance from new antennas and not the power. But I will agree that, you know, we should get our arms around the power density. What's an acceptable level of power density of all the antennas in an area. And because one tower interacts with another tower, it's, you know, and understand, and this, I wanted to say one more thing. This came as a quote from the CTIA right here. So they're saying today, which was last year or 2 years ago, 154,000 cell towers today. And this is a quote from the CTIA. There are 154,000 cell towers today. To meet growing mobile data demands and win the race to 5G projects, we will need to install hundreds of thousands of small cells in the next few years. S&P Global Market Intelligence projects more than 800,000 small cells will be deployed by 2026. Wow, 154 towers to 800,000. Not to mention what SpaceX is sending up every day or every week or two. They're sending up hundreds of satellites. There's going to be over 100,000 or so satellites beaming down signals. So I don't know. Call me crazy. I just think we need to pause. And I wish this was really being discussed at the national level where it should be being discussed. But we can't even get through to congressmen and senators. Follow the money. The one beauty thing about New Hampshire is we don't get paid off. We don't, especially in the House. There's 400 of us. No lobbyists have called me from the other side, none, which is good. They know my position. But I'm just saying, you know, if you read the whole report that we produced, we have very rational conclusions, very rational solutions. You know, from warnings, you know, and by the way, this is only about, I mean, the commission we started out as 5G commission, but we quickly discovered we can't talk about 5G without talking about 3G and 4G. It's all linked together. And then you can't talk about AT&T versus Verizon because they have different strategies. So you can't really put your hand around it. We talked about antenna, what's inside those antennas? how are they configured? I think Representative Wells, maybe that's a good segue to him, because he's the one who really seems to know a lot about that, as well as Dr. Chamberlain.
Thank you,
Okay.
Representative. That is a good segue. I think I would like to hear from the Honorable Ken Wells right now, and
Thank you.
I'd like to be done with this by noontime. So if there's anyone else that wishes to speak on this, please, if you give us a card just so that we have a copy of your name and so forth. Not trying to make it a formality, but we do need to copy that down. Representative Partial?
That's the question of our,
Yes. No, turn it on.
that would help, thank you. Will this representative be available for questions later on? We have also, as part of this bill, there's a self-reporting registry. And I'll be honest, I don't have any particular ideas on that, but I would love to hear how that would work, and I would hate that to get pushed aside. I understand that you have a lot of issues to address here, and I just would hate to see that forgotten in the course of discussing the science and the politics behind this. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, from a bill standpoint, I'm willing to set that one aside so we can focus on, in terms of the bill, and go forward. Because there's enough concerns about that in terms of how it would work that I would say amend that out, and let's just focus on the cell tower.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I'd like to start out just by clarifying some of the definitions here. We started out with the commission looking at the 5G health effects, but we discovered quickly that 5G is not a physical description. It's a marketing term. It means new and improved. Okay? And what we're talking about here, let's not talk about 5G and 4G or broadband internet. What we're talking about here specifically is radio frequency radiation. Okay? And radio frequency radiation can hurt you. Now, thank you, Representative Nodder, for your very good introduction where you talked about wattages and frequency ranges of the band of the spectrum. But there are a couple of things that you left out. And one is, it's not just the power of the transmitter, it's how close it is. Okay? And that is what has a very large effect on living systems. My background is in biochemistry and biophysics. And so we heard in that introduction about thermal effects and ionizing radiation. But radio frequency will also affect biomembrane potentials. And what I mean by biomembranes, these are the membranes involved in your nervous system. They're the membranes involved in reproduction, like when an ovum is fertilized by one sperm, it changes the voltage on the outside of the thing, so a second one can't get in ordinarily. Photosynthesis uses membrane potentials. Birds and bees use it for navigation. It's involved in blood clotting, and it's involved in oxidation, as Dr. Chamberlain mentioned. We don't even have to give up any of the advantages of communication and high-speed stuff when we give up high energy, high density radio frequency, because optical, fiber optics, and light transmitted stuff is 100 times faster. So the vested interests here are the people who are making and selling radio frequency stuff. If we could talk a little bit about the distance and the densification. It's a well-known thing in physics. Gauss's law tells you how much the field dissipates as you back away from a source, okay? And if it was a spherical distribution, same in all directions, the bigger that bubble gets, the more its area increases, and the same amount of energy is spread over a larger area. However, with this type of application, you can shape the shape of the emissions the same way that you can shape the light emitted from a street light. The light doesn't go straight up into outer space. You reflect it back down where you want it. Now, if you're going to do a communications network, you would reflect it out as much as you could into a horizontal cookie shape, right? In that case, the amount of energy is going to be dissipated over the circumference of that circle, okay? 2 pi r. So if you are 1 football field away from a standard transmitter antenna, you would get a certain amount of energy. We'll just call it, a bucket load of energy. If you had evenly spaced antennas, that same 1 football field apart, there would be about 6 of them in the circle around you. you would get 6 times as much exposure from those. If you have another circle that's 2 football fields away, 12 of them will fit there, and you get another 6. Okay, so this is the thing about densification. If you have more and more and more and more of these things, and Representative Abrami was just talking about 150,000 more of these things. If you're talking about the density that 5G providers are advertising, they're advertising putting one down every 100 meters. Okay, that's a very large grid, and if you think of a city, if you had one every 100 meters in a checkerboard, it's a huge number of antennas. They also advertise that you can concentrate the field at a particular point. And the way you do that is these antennas operate independently. They have an internet connection, and they can delay the signal so that they can steer the beam, okay? And if you do that, you can get many, many, many times higher energy at a certain location than you even get at the transmitter right at the antenna. The difficulty is that there are 3 parameters here that we need to worry about, and a couple of them Representative Nodder talked about. The frequency, as the frequency goes up, the amount of energy increases. The wattage of the transmitter, how bright the light bulb is another thing. And the third thing is the distance. And it turns out we can't control the first 2 because those are controlled by software. And you know how Dieselgate worked, right? They fiddled the software so they got it to do stuff that they weren't allowed to do. You wouldn't be able to stop them from doing that. And I don't even think that the companies that sell 5G know what they're buying because they're not manufacturing the stuff. We certainly don't want people who manufacture these things to put capabilities in there that would expose us to more of this radiation. Dave Dubé, who was mentioned representing BIA, said that the power level of the transmitter is a hard number to nail down. And that's because if the engineers want to do it, they can make it perform within this little envelope when it's being reviewed and tested and expand it to that in use, same way Dieselgate worked. So we need to be careful about what we allow in New Hampshire, and the only thing we really have, the only tool we have, is to make sure those antennas are not so close together. And one of my hobbies is auto racing, and you can get hurt in auto racing. And you look at what is the most likely bad thing that could happen, and then you change your equipment and you take safety precautions to make sure that bad thing can't happen. It's called the precautionary principle. And I think that we should exercise a precautionary principle here and limit how close those antennas can be to each other and also to people. And so I'd be happy to answer any further questions you have.
Thank you, the Honorable Wells. It's nice having you back in here again. I don't want to cut your time short. I do have a question. If we feel like we have to stay later, you may stay and come back. And I don't think there's anyone here from the provider area to answer this question, but perhaps you can. Is there a minimum distance that antennas need to be placed in order for them to work with the data stream that they want to project? In other words, is there a distance of, say, maybe 10 feet, 20 feet, 100 feet, 500 feet that they can't be placed any closer because it wouldn't serve their purpose to transmit data? What I'm getting at is I'm trying to figure out from a technological point of view, what's the minimum distance that they can't get any closer to, otherwise they're just not going to work.
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, when you get antennas very, very close together, you get all kinds of interference, reflections off of buildings and things like that, which cause your signal to get garbled. If you imagine being in a room with 3 or 4 radios going, right, it'd be hard to understand what was going on, even though it's getting louder, right? And what we want to do is we want to make sure that that signal doesn't get so loud that it hurts people, okay? Because as you get them very close together, it needs to get louder in order for the signal to get through. So there's a diminishing return. The other limitation that was mentioned, though, is that the higher frequency you go up, the more oxygen in the environment absorbs the signal, especially water vapor. remember that we're 3/4 water. We absorb this stuff too, right? And it's not good for us. In fact, it's not just the oxygen, but it's all those other, biomembranes and things like that will participate in what's called resonance. Resonance is matching the frequency of something that can jiggle around, a molecule, say. And an analogy I think of is, when we were little kids and we learned how to swing a playground swing, we discovered you couldn't go like this because it wouldn't go. You had to match the frequency, right? When the frequencies match, that wave gets bigger and bigger and bigger until something breaks, okay? And forms free radicals, does some oxidation, does some other sort of side reactions that are not good for us. Those are the frequencies that happen in this millimeter wave range, starting at around 600 megahertz and coming all the way up to 1 to 3 millimeters, which are the frequencies that the military has developed into a weapon. It certainly does harm. So those are the things that we want to attenuate. If we need to have wireless communication that has higher data transmission rates, we should look at laser. It's much better, safer technology. Having sunlight shine on you is generally not too bad. Which brings me to one other point. A lot of these studies, particularly older ones, treat radiation as if it was a toxic chemical, and they establish what they call an SAR, which is how many watts per kilogram. That's irrelevant. Okay, if you're talking about how much sunburn you're going to get from radiation, it's watts per square meter. Okay, and so much of the inconclusive reports that you go out there are using the wrong unit. And so if you look at the stuff that is based on watts per square meter, it's fairly convincing, because it's not just humans that are affected by this. A very good study out of Germany that looked at tree growth, and the side that faces towards the tree is damaged, okay? And it doesn't matter how it's oriented north-south and all that stuff. They did a huge number of trees and examined these things, and the trees are damaged by being close to an antenna. And the damage lessens as you get further away. We know that if you put a cell phone that's on in a beehive, it'll kill the hive, right? So birds and bees, pollinators, absolutely crucial, are affected by this stuff. So there is a lot of research out here that points out that it's harmful. And if you look at the 390-page report, there are pages and pages of citations of these types of things. We took 14 months and we looked at a lot of stuff.
Thank you. If I could ask, we're getting close to our time here. If Representative Kelly Pitts, if you ask one question, and then I would like to call on the only person that is right now would be speaking against the bill, and give that side an opportunity before I move on to this other person who, because we've heard a lot on why we should pass the bill and all that stuff, and which is good. We need to hear that, but I'd like to hear from the opposing side before our time runs out. So one question, Representative Kelly Pitts.
Ken, I'm picturing a streetscape, poles, antennas on poles. So you go 1,000 feet, you have an antenna. What do you do about the person whose house is less than 1,000 feet from that pole?
Yeah, this is a concern, because somebody who has a second floor front bedroom and has one on the pole may only be 30 feet away from that transmitter and is getting really a high dosage from that one. And they are also getting additional from the ones further up and down the street and a block away. And all of those signals overlap. So yeah, you get a real intensification by putting lots and lots of these down. Representative Paschal's analogy, rather than swimming pools, if you think of lawn sprinklers, okay? If you have a lot of lawn sprinklers in an area, the more of them there are, the wetter you're going to get. And that's exactly what's going on here.
I'll follow up with you later.
Okay, thank you very much. If you don't mind, if I could ask Mr. Rick Fabrizio from BIA to come up and give him a few minutes to discuss. Before you start talking, I just want to, there were some questions asked before, and I become into some information. The question was asked about if any other state had banned 5G. Best to our knowledge, no states have banned 5G at this point. And of course, I'll get to this later, but Representative Callie Pitts is right. We're preempted by federal law on certain things that we can do with this bill, and we'll get back to that later. But apparently, our hands could be tied in some respect. But we'll talk about that later. I also want to say that I'm told that FCC Chair Rosenworcel is not a lobbyist. That she worked as a public servant for two senators on the Senate Commerce Committee before joining the FCC. Two Democrat senators. Another FCC Commissioner, Jeffrey Starks, is also not a lobbyist. He was an attorney for DOJ, focused on law enforcement, and before that, focused on national security. Before that, he was an attorney and a law clerk at the Eighth Circuit. So those are two examples that we're not lobbyists, at least not at the time anyway. So with that being said, Mr. Fabrizio, please go ahead.
Thank you. I am Rick Fabrizio. I'm Director of Communications and Public Policy for the Business and Industry Association. I would state that if this bill is passed, it would greatly slow New Hampshire's efforts to expand broadband throughout states, especially the areas that are unserved. The bill, as we all know, would require setbacks of 1,640 feet from any, parks, playgrounds, residentially zoned neighborhoods, hospitals, nursing homes, daycare centers, and schools. If you think about that in reality, you're going to block the deployment of cell tower telecommunication antennae virtually everywhere in the state when you account for the location of all of those different things. It used to be, as part of the Telecommunications Act of 1996, that highways were identified as good places where you could put telecommunication antennae. But as we continue to see increased residential development in the state, more and more of these new neighborhoods are encroaching on highways, which again is going to render the placement of telecommunication antennae, if not possible, so greatly restricted that that is what would stop or significantly impede the efforts to expand broadband throughout the state. So there's discussion of, that 1640, that's 1,640 feet. Broadband wavelength has a reach of about 1,000 feet. Again, that's going to render that unusable. The reason why for 5G is that it provides, even though it has lesser range of the previous generations, is that it provides greater speed and capacity. That is the number one need, what we're talking about with high-speed broadband internet, speed and capacity. We've heard today, and we've heard previously in the committee meeting about can't fiber optic do it? Fiber optic is a backbone of telecommunication industries, but it's prohibitively expensive to route it to the last mile, as you often hear, those homes that are unserved or underserved. So not only is it prohibitively expensive, it doesn't provide Wi-Fi. Now, I suppose there is some way in your home that you could connect your phone, your mobile phone, directly to Wi-Fi, but most instances you're going to need something like a Wi-Fi router in order to have your phone access a fiber optic network. The thing that's most troubling about this bill is its lack of specifics and ambiguity. The bill clearly says telecommunication antennae. That would block just about everything from your regular cell phone towers to your distributed antennae systems that offer a less power, lower profile tower than to the traditional towers. But not only would it block the distributed antennae systems, it would also block public Wi-Fi, which most providers like Comcast, AT&T, et cetera, have public Wi-Fi antennae, if you will, located throughout the street. Those would also fall under this. Even Wi-Fi in buildings that we see, and we see so many people using their phones, tablets, Chromebooks at all, they would have less ability to connect to it. I would disagree that looking at 5G, classifying it as, 4G is cellular and 5G is data, and nobody needs to be watching a movie while walking down the street. While I agree they don't need to be watching a movie while walking down the street, I don't think that's what the future of 5G is providing for. It's providing for high-speed, reliable broadband internet, and it is a crucial part of bringing Wi-Fi to all areas of the state. We've heard a lot today and in the previous testimony of research that says it causes harm. it's not a problem. This is part of the process. There are different people cite expert says it causes harm. Other experts say it's not proven to cause harm. In the minority report of the 5G Commission, which said that 5G poses significant health to humans and the environment, the World Health Organization and the FDA did not support that contention. So while I'm not going to forgive Congress or any of the other governing bodies for not moving this up on their list, like it or not, this research all has to come together and be vetted by an agreed upon agency, which should be a government agency that can take all the information together and distill a final report. Because one group saying one thing and one group saying another is not the answer to this. But we do know that the state needs to continue to expand broadband for economic purposes. From everything from telehealth to remote learning to businesses, the state is going to require more and more online data capacity in order for our economy to continue to grow and function at the level it needs to be done. I would ask that you look strictly at this bill on the note that it would preemptively ban most new telecommunication antennae of all variety throughout the state. If the goal was to make sure that they're not placed every 200 meters, the bill should have looked at that, not set such strict bans that you will be hard-pressed to find another location for a telecommunication antennae moving forward, which again includes all Wi-Fi routers. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Before I take any questions, I'd like to read to further substantiate what Representative Kelly Pitts had said before about the Federal Communications Act of 1996 and get your view on that. From what this comes from the FCC site. It says that in particular, Section 704 of the Act states that, quote, no state or local government or instrumentality thereof may regulate the placement, construction, and modification of personal wireless service facilities on the basis of the environmental effects of radio frequency emissions to the extent that such facilities comply with the Commission's regulations concerning such emissions. Does, if we were to place maybe no broad restrictions, but if we were to even set even smaller distances in the 1,640 feet, would this regulation here prevent us from even doing that?
That was what I meant to mention it in this period, but I was kind of going off the cuff. It was one of my initial concerns with the bill is the fact that it would run afoul of the Telecommunications Act, which part of the reason why it was created was to facilitate an agreed upon acceptable placement of telecommunication antennae. I would think that this law, as it stands, would be at odds with the federal regulation.
Thank you. Representative Kelly Pitts.
I have two questions. One was the Federal Telecommunications Act, but we also have local zoning in this state, where zoning boards and local people, and at one point, I believe some towers way back in the beginning were the subject of the SEC. Can local boards still regulate the placement of towers? And I'm going to just follow up with the second question really quickly, is that you mentioned the cost of price and that fiber is much more expensive, and we know that certain company left because they didn't want to do fiber or expand fiber. What the criteria for expanding broadband, one of the criteria is affordability. So would 5G rollout be more affordable? And I mean, these are the federal criteria.
With not being an expert on it, but knowing that if you do the research on fiber optic, it's very expensive. And then when you factor in the companies who are putting it in, if you put in fiber optic in an urban area where, say, Manchester with 110,000 people, that cost per person goes down. If you're looking to run fiber optic to the rural parts of the state where you might have 5 homes per mile, that's when it really becomes cost prohibitive, because the service providers cannot possibly justify that type of per household cost, because the houses are so far, they're separated, and there's so many few of them. Fiber optic is a backbone of it. And again, I would say that you have to have wireless for the phones and the tablets and everything else to connect. If you look at the Internet of Things, in 5 years, more and more you'll have smart refrigerators, completely controlled heating systems. All of this is a Wi-Fi based thing. And yes, that itself can tie into fiber optic, but fiber optic doesn't right now really bridge the gap to wireless. But again, most importantly, it goes back to it's very cost prohibitive to deliver the last mile of broadband via fiber optic.
Follow up? Go ahead, one more.
Just a quick follow-up, is that, so the construction of these small towers, every, I don't know how many feet, is going to be far less inexpensive, even though federal money is working the grant for this?
Delivering fiber optic to the last mile to those rural areas where you don't have a density of housing is going to be cost prohibitive. If you were to rely on the federal funding, you're going to chew through that federal funding a lot more quickly if your end goal is to deliver fiber optic to every house in unserved, underserved rural areas.
Representative Partial?
Thank you again. As a recent recipient of high-speed fiber in my house, I've watched my own bill decrease by greater than half. Thanks to a bill passed by the House, originating in the Senate and passing the House, we have the ability now to go to our municipalities and bonding with local internet companies, we are able to go that last mile at an affordable price. I'm really wondering if this prohibitive expense is really that prohibitive when I've seen my own bill drop. And as far as my telephone works, I am very, very happy that I can finally pick up, because I have a Wi-Fi router, I can finally hook up my cell phone to get a voice over internet protocol, which I was not able to get before because I was relying upon a cell phone service. I find my fiber optic to be of a high caliber, high quality product. I really, and we talk about broadband as far as what we have for cellular. Broadband has to function right now by definition around 50 megabytes per second. And while the claim is that 5G is able to do that, I believe they are if they were able to densify their towers enough. The cost of getting that 50G, I really would question. Most 5G towers are not putting out nearly that rate. So I guess I find myself conflicted.
I would say for sure, this isn't an either-or approach to broadband. You're not going to get there all with fiber optic. You're not going to get there all with wireless. This is a composite of using all the different technologies to increase broadband access and to allow for the increased capacity, increased speed, because even what's being installed now will have a shelf life, because the amount of data, the amount of online life, business, shopping, banking, entertainment, you name it, is increasingly going online. The state has to continue to move forward to make sure that it has a proper high-speed internet infrastructure. And as my written testimony had presented before, that it's really not unlike railroads in the 1800s and highways in the 1900s, or the advent and the deployment of electricity. It's not unlike that for economic development. It's crucially important. And again, I would warn that this bill poses a threat to that investment, because again, I don't see where you're going to site a new telecommunication antennae, which includes the full-size towers, the distributed antennae systems, even public Wi-Fi. I don't know where you place those with such strict limits.
Thank you. I realize there's probably more questions to be asked of you, but if I would like to get the next speaker in before noontime. If the subcommittee decides that we need to come back after lunch, we can. I think we have this room. We can decide that after we break for lunch. Well, no, we'll decide before we break for lunch if we need to come back again. But in the meantime, let me ask Cecilia Doucette, excuse me, to come up here. Thank you. You're welcome to stay around. We may have further discussion later.
Good afternoon, or good morning still. Thank you. My name is Cecilia Doucette. I am the Education Services Director for an international nonprofit called Wireless Education. I am also the Director of Massachusetts for Safe Technology. And like most of you, I had no idea that there was anything to worry about with wireless. In fact, for 8 years, I ran campaigns for our public schools when we were hearing about the 21st century classroom and how our kids were going to need to have iPads, Chromebooks, wireless infrastructure. So I was on the wrong side of this. And then one night at book group, my girlfriend Wendy, who's an electrical engineer, tipped me off that there could be biological harm. So I am a technical and professional writer by trade, so I just started looking for the science, which is what the New Hampshire Commission so dutifully did in their report. So really, I hope you will all look at this over the next week very seriously. Over the weekend, I sent you all 3 separate emails. The first one gives the backstory on how Rep. Abrami came into this topic. The second one talks about the report itself. And so I want to tell you who was on that commission. You know your colleagues here, engineers, but we also had Dr. Gary Woods, a medical doctor. We had Dr. Tom Sherman, a medical doctor. We had Denise Riccardi, who is now Senator Denise Riccardi, who fought off cell towers in her town. She's a wealth of information. We also had Dr. Kent Chamberlain. We had former Representative Wells, who has, as you know, a scientific background. And we also had Dr. Paul Heroux, who is one of the world's leading radiation scientists. In fact, he has created cancer in his lab from this radio frequency. And he was coming down from McGill University, where he teaches electromagnetics. So this is the first time in our country that any qualified board has looked at this issue. So please, this is our nation's leading document today because our federal agencies have dropped the ball. You guys are it. When you look at that minority report, you will find a lot of information in there that looks really good, but what you're not seeing is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So I just want to point you to a few bullet items. They give assurances that you have to have heat to have harm. Well, as our experts here have told you, we have great harm happening at the non-thermal level. They also reference the IEEE, or the Institute for Electronics and Electrical Engineers, which is a wonderful profession, but with all due respect, they are not medical doctors and they are not EMF scientists. And as Rep. Abrami stated, he tried to get them to the table, but they had nobody to bring. You should also know that the industry references Dr. Jeffrey Shuren at the FDA. Dr. Shuren is married to a partner in a law firm that represents the wireless industry. He should have been nowhere near our government studies on radio frequency radiation. The industry will also indicate the American Cancer Society says there's no harm, but our government completed a $30 million study. It's the largest study the U.S. National Toxicology Program has ever completed on any toxin, and they are the gold standard in the world on toxins. After an unprecedented 3-day peer review at the National Institutes of Health with world-leading experts weighing in their final report, they conclude clear evidence of cancerous tumors and DNA damage, among other findings. Clear evidence is the highest of 5 categories that they can assign. So this is not to be taken lightly. We do have conclusive causation now that we didn't have back in 2011 when the World Health Organization classified this as a Group 2B possible human carcinogen. Now the industry, when a good study comes out, will try to counter that and say, oh, that's just one study. You need more than that to prove it. Well, right on the heels of the U.S. National Toxicology Program study, the Ramazzini Institute in Italy completed another very large study that corroborated the findings of cancer and DNA damage that we had here. And the American Cancer Society said this is paradigm shifting good science. So what we thought we knew before doesn't apply anymore. You should also know that the American Cancer Society is reporting sharp rises right now in colon cancers and rectal cancers among young adults at the very spots where they're tucking their devices into their waistbands and into their back pockets, and where they're holding their tablets and their iPads, their Chromebooks. So you need to take everything the industry says with a grain of salt and then go to the independent scientific experts for answers. The World Health Organization, you need to know that there are two groups looking at electromagnetic fields at the World Health Organization. One is very heavily industry funded. The other is independent scientists. After the US and the Italian studies produced the animal studies that were missing back in 2011, when they declared it a Group 2B possible human carcinogen, we now have those. The WHO has reopened their investigation in 2020, and in the next couple of years, they're supposed to be weighing in on this. But the question remains, will it be a stacked agency project again with industry? And as for the gentleman you referenced with ICNIRP, the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, that is also a very heavily industry-funded group. So we need to know who we're getting our information from. The industry will also tell us that cancer rates are going down, but again, when we look at certain cancer rates, like brain tumors, France's have quadrupled where we're holding a cell phone to our head. In England, the incidence of these glioblastoma multiforme, these are the deadliest types of tumors, they have more than doubled. In India, brain tumors in children and adults are increasing. And the industry tends to focus on cancer outcomes because that takes the longest to develop. But there are many, many very serious health effects happening right now, including infertility. They've taken male human sperm, exposed it to a laptop with the antennas turned on. It changed the DNA. It slowed the motility, and it caused far fewer sperm to be viable in just 4 hours of exposure. That's actually the set of studies that got me on my feet and gave me the courage to speak up, because we had just given my college-age daughter a laptop to go to college with. We had just given my high school-age daughter a laptop to go to high school with, and where are they both using it? Put right on top of their reproductive organs. And we now have studies from Kaiser Permanente and others that show increased miscarriage rates with women who are using radio frequency communication devices. So when the industry starts discussing these 5G millimeter waves, they once again turn to the IEEE for their expertise. Those are not doctors or scientists. And in fact, the IEEE has already put out some studies that indicate, yes, there are biological effects. So again, every time the industry tells you something that makes you think you want to believe what they're saying, dig deeper. In February of 2019, US Senator Richard Blumenthal called out the FCC in a federal commerce hearing. And he said to them, so please share with us, how much money have you invested for independent science to prove that 5G is safe before we roll this out? And both of those industry representatives had to fess up that they don't know of any safety testing that has been done on this. So we should not be putting this into our communities. When you talk about before and after, I want to share with you that back in 2019, when Rep. Abrami first introduced his House Bill 522 that led to this law, and this was the first law in the land to form a commission and to look at this, we were invited to come in the morning when the industry representatives were giving their pitch on how come New Hampshire should get on the bandwagon and do what Boston has done and get all this new wireless infrastructure. Well, I want to tell you what's happened in Boston. So this is a radio frequency radiation detection meter. And it's hard because these are invisible waves. We can't get our mind around it. But when I turn this on, we will get an ambient reading in this room. And you know, it's a little dummy proof for those of us who don't know the numbers or the science that well. We know green, yellow, red, right? Right here in this room, just the ambient environment is hitting a peak of 2,530 microwatts per square meter. And it's that peak that we need to be very much aware of, because that's what's damaging our cells. So don't listen to any industry averages. It's the spiked erratic pulse of microwave radiation that is harming our cells. But I want to show you what happens when I take my cell phone out of airplane mode and I get an active signal. So we were at what, 2,000 a moment ago? Watch how this goes. I'm now at 114,000 microwatts per square meter. I went in, I was one of the folks who held on to her 3G phone, and I had to go back to the store because I got the letter that said they're going to discontinue 3G. And I got to chatting with a couple of guys at the store, and I said, do you guys want to know why I'm asking if I can hardwire the replacement phone? And it was slow that day, so we chit-chatted. And one of the kids pulled out his new 5G phone. And when I measured it with the antennas on for 5G, it went over 1 million. In our sleeping areas, the science indicates we should be at 0.1 microwatts per square meter. In the outdoor areas, they recommend 1,000 or less. And that's presuming that you get to go home and allow your body the proper space to detoxify in your own private setting. If you put a cell tower outside of somebody's home, their body is never going to be able to catch up. And then you see this whole downstream effect. And you know, when you go out and you look at the official websites from our captured agencies or from ICNIRP, you will see is information to give you a false sense of security. But the science has progressed, and we know of at least 8 different ways that this radiation damages our biological cells. Our experts here have talked about oxidative stress. They've talked about the free radicals. We've talked about infertility. We should also know about the rouleau effect. So this is a magnetic field. Our red blood cells are meant to be free-floating and bringing oxygen to all of our systems. When we are exposed to radio frequency radiation, it can cause our blood cells to glom up. And I remember the rouleau effect because when I was a kid, I liked those candies called Rolos that are stacked up. So instead of free-floating, our red blood cells start glomming up into this chain that can then no longer get to where it needs to bring oxygen to our major organs and every cell in our body. So oxidative stress and the rouleau effect are very, very critically important. And we know that in a controlled medical setting, we can do really good things with this technology. We can stimulate stem cell growth. We can stimulate bone cell growth. But in this uncontrolled way, that the industry has convinced us that all Wi-Fi all the time is the way to go, there's no control and there's no escape from it. So as much as we've been told that we have to have wireless, our experts here are on the right path when they tell us that we should invest as much as we can in hardwired fiber or high-speed cable or copper to and through the premises. My house, completely hardwired. Not hard to do. You put an Ethernet cable, you put an Ethernet jack, you buy little adapters, and you hook it all up. You might have to give up a little convenience. Maybe you can't walk into the bathroom with your cell phone, right? Or put an Ethernet jack in your bathroom and just plug it in. But Dr. Timothy Sheckley with the National Institute for Science, Law, and Public Policy has a wonderful resource for you called Reinventing Wires, the Future of Landlines and Networks. Wi-Fi is great for the wireless industry. Wi-Fi is not sustainable. When we have natural disasters, look what happened at the fires out in California. People could not get a call out because the cell towers had burnt down. Those who still had hardwired landlines could get emergency response. So it's a very, very serious misstep when we allow the industry to talk us out of maintaining the landlines. So I hope you will take that very much to heart. And as far as the legalities of this, I would direct you to Americans for Responsible Technology. This is a nonprofit, award-winning group. They've received awards from the Environmental Protection Agency for the incredible work they do to try and protect our children. They have taken best practices from around the country that have upheld in courts of law. The industry will tell you it's coming, there's nothing you can do about it. That Telecom Act makes it so you can't say anything about where you want to put these, but that's simply not true. Congress preserved our local municipal rights to a degree. And so I won't go into detail here, but there's a lot that our towns can do. Starting with, don't put wireless communication facilities in residential areas. If you can do it and cover the gap in coverage, put them in industrial complexes, 300 feet up in the air where they're supposed to be. Do not put them in our schoolyards. Do not put them on our hospitals. Do not put them on our senior centers. And don't put them on our playing grounds either. So it's all out there. And I am telling you, this report has done an incredible job of making your job easy. They spent 1.5 years on this. I know you guys only have a week, but they have done their job, and I am asking that you support the hard work that went on before this committee reconvened. And were you able to distribute these to your full board?
I did give them out to be distributed. I assume everyone got one, yes.
Yeah, so this is an excellent way just to share with your family, share with your loved ones what this invisible toxin is. And then just, start taking your baby steps at home. I can be brought in to do training sessions. I've already been brought into the Keene Public Library. I was brought into Taylor Community Center with the senior citizens. And I give talks all over the country, all over the world, and just step everybody through this, because once we know what these risks are, it's just common sense to choose safe, sustainable technology. Wireless is not sustainable. It's just not. Hardwire, fiber to and through the premises will last for years and years, and it will adapt with technology. You're not going to have to keep reinvesting like they want us to do with all of our wireless devices. So I thank you for your time. I know it's a lot to get your arms around in a short amount of time, but if there's anything I can do to help you connect those dots, I would be so honored.
Thank you. Anyone have a question? Okay, my question to the subcommittee is, do you want, there's at least one other speaker coming up. Do you want to cover that? Do you want a lunch break? Do you think we need to come back for some more discussion for more than, say, 15, 20 minutes? Or do you want to take care of this last speaker, and then we can talk about whether we need to come back again this week? Representative Parcel?
I'd be happy to defer to your judgment, whatever that may be. However, I am wondering, there was discussed the possibility of splitting this bill into two sections, one addressing the placement of cell towers, the other the registry. And I'm wondering if we want to address that as part of this committee as well. And again, I'll defer to your judgment on all of this.
Yeah, I didn't hear that. Not sure we have the time to go into that. Splitting a bill is going to be very difficult, I think, at this time. Oh. Good.
Representative Abrami, to my recollection, said he wouldn't mind eliminating that registry part of the bill for right now.
Yes,
to
yes.
an amendment,
That we
not
can
a
certainly,
split bill.
right. That could certainly be one of our options that we can discuss. I think for right now, I believe, Michelle Roberge is here, and let's continue with her. You would like to hang around?
May I just make one more comment? We have developed online training for schools and families and for the corporate workplace that can be completed online off the shelf in about a half an hour. During this pandemic, we had given every child a wireless device to access their education with absolutely no safety testing, no safety training. And you know that those kids are sleeping with those tablets. And this is extraordinarily biologically harmful. So regardless of what you do with this bill, we need to get education out to our families immediately. And our nonprofit would be honored to give you the licensing to protect the children in New Hampshire and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. Michelle Roberge, come on up. Come on down.
Thank you, members of the committee. I'll be very brief today. My name is Michelle Roberge, and I'm the administrator of the Bureau of Public Health Protection within the Division of Public Health at the Department of Health and Human Services. And I just wanted to remind the committee, the department is neutral on this bill, but we do have some concerns related to the registry. And I know some of you had a few questions. There is a fiscal impact to the department on the registry component of it, and I wanted to just note that there is no rulemaking authority within the language of the bill or an appropriation to support the registry. And that's really our only concern, is if we're asked to do this registry, that there is no appropriation and there's no rulemaking. And we filed a fiscal note, and we also provided testimony during the public hearing as well.
Thank you. Would we remind everybody that there is going to be a public hearing continuation on this bill, I believe, on February 7th in the morning, to take care of the speakers. I think they didn't get a chance to speak, if I'm correct on that. And then there'll be an exec session in the afternoon. So yeah. The hearing's at 1. Okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, yes, yeah, you're right, 1 o'clock. Well, I'll have to double check on that. I know there's going to be a public hearing done. Right, I know I can't be here in the morning, but I'll be here in the afternoon. So, okay, any other questions? Okay, so my question to the subcommittee now is, do you see a need to come back this afternoon for more discussion amongst us, or we could, I'll check and see if we're able to have another subcommittee meeting maybe this Thursday, if it's allowable. I don't know if who's available. You're not available on Thursday. What's the subcommittee feeling on this? Okay. Turn on.
How is this subcommittee going to make a recommendation if we don't discuss it? That's all I want to say. Availability, we're here. Can we have, 15, 20 minutes and not have to have a lunch at 12:30?
Sure.
If
Yeah,
that,
that's why I'm asking. Yeah, we can continue.
that would be fine with me. I know there's another hearing going on at 1 o'clock in the State House, but how can we make a recommendation?
Exactly. Thoughts?
I have thoughts.
Yeah.
The results of any given study depends largely upon who pays for the study. And I always keep that in mind. And there's so much conflicting information out there. It's like, who do we believe? You got one set of scientists that says this, you got this one set of scientists that says that. Who's to say that this side is correct and this side is wrong? Because again, who pays for the study? And all right, let's take the climate. We have one set of scientists that says we're in a climate crisis, we're all gonna die. And then I learned that there's tens of thousands of scientists worldwide that say we're not in a climate crisis. And they don't get any credence because they don't go along with what an administration decided is true. Therefore, they're canceled. So we had the commission, and they spent a year and a half, but I don't want to use the word stacked because it doesn't sound nice, but it was, because the other side wasn't part of it for whatever reason. And I'm having a really hard time with this because we have to think about New Hampshire as a whole, and we can't just stop industry when there's still information out there from studies that say that it's inconclusive. And when in doubt, throw it out. Those are my thoughts.
Representative White, do you have any comments? I haven't heard from you for a while.
So my main concerns around this were the financial aspect. If we can dump
Go closer.
Oh, sorry. My main concerns were around the 1.5 million over 3 years. That's ridiculous. So if we get rid of that and only focus on the tower location piece of it, I'm not certain. Honestly, I want to dive into the report, that and all the studies that the report references. So I need, I don't know, 60 hours, no sleep.
We don't have 60 hours, unfortunately. Representative Calipitz?
I would like to see this subcommittee recommend to the full committee that this go into interim study. I think we do not know. I mean, there's so much conflict. We know that something is going on. Are we going to stop industry? No. Industry will march on, and there's going to be a federal rollout. All these things are coming. There's also an RSA where we gave up control of the telecommunication industry that we did in New Hampshire, as well as the act. But I would like to delve more into exactly what's happening and come to a fair conclusion. We heard majority, one side of this whole story. I would like to read that report, and then I would like to go with the other side of the story. I know Canada has just done a rollout. Well, what does rollout mean? There's all these questions, and I don't have answers to them. I did go by where I used to work in Portsmouth and look at this humongous tower that seems to have grown up next to the senior citizens apartment. I said, oh, wait a minute. So I think at this point the recommendation, if that's possible, I would like to see interim study and forget the amendment for now. Because if we go into interim, we can take that out at any time, the registry part, and just look into what the consequences of this new rollout is going to be.
Okay. Representative Parsons, do you have one way or the other?
Yes, I think that right where I'm sitting right now, I feel like I could have my mind changed. I'm seeing this bill as something that ought to pass, as long as Representative White said, we could remove that one part about the self-reporting registry. I think we're opening a can of worms with that. But I think there's enough information right now that we can go ahead and recommend this bill ought to pass, and we can always go back and revisit it later on if we are concerned about stifling industry in the state of New Hampshire. I think it's a more conservative approach. And I think you've heard a good amount of testimony today about the dangers of EMF radiation, and also about how many of the people who are speaking of it are speaking from the lobbyists have something to make from this. We're seeing private citizens come forward and say they don't have a vested interest in the project itself, but they have concerns. I think that's so. I would say that I would recommend this with the removal of that one amendment as an OTP.
Well, if we did the amendment, it would be an OTPA, but I'm not so sure that we want to go that route per se. I do like the thought of the interim study, because whichever way we go, we would need more time to formulate a proper response. I wouldn't be opposed to the interim study on that. Representative Otter?
I agree with what Representative Calipitz said, and you. Normally, I'm against studies. Because what are you going to study? You're going to study the study? But there is another side to the whole issue, and there is more to study.
It would give us at least time to formulate some type of perhaps an amendment instead of just trying to scurry it this week. Representative White?
So if we refer this to interim study, what does that mean? What's the timeline look like? I'm not
Well,
really sure how that works.
Normally, interim study during the second year of a biennium, normally they're used to sometimes just make a bill go away. But I would not want that to happen in this case. We would have the authorization to schedule another study on this. I'm not sure if the subcommittee would be, it's probably a subcommittee involved with the interim study on that. But we could, it's possible we could also schedule a full committee work session too. So we have those options available to us. It'll be up to Chairman Vose to decide on how he wants to go with that. But here, as a subcommittee, we could recommend to the full committee that we do interim study, and the full committee would vote on that. And should it pass, then we would. I don't even think we have. That doesn't even come up for a vote before the full House. It just goes into interim study. In which case, both Vose and I would be responsible for us to schedule the next meetings for further study. Kelly Pitts?
Do we have to take a vote on the bill? This is an early bill, is that correct?
No, this is not an early bill.
It's
I don't
not an
believe.
early bill.
Is it? I didn't think it was. It has an FN, but I didn't think it was an early bill. Yeah. Quickly.
Yeah, it's an early bill because of the second part of the bill, because it mentioned in the fiscal note FTEs and stuff like that. I did talk to the speaker about it. I said, can the committee just, if they amend it out, it's still going to have to go to the floor. And so, no, it
But we
has
can-
to be voted out next week.
But we can recommend interim study,
Yes,
and
Absolutely.
and the committee would vote on that. And,
Right.
and I don't believe interim study comes up before the
yes,
House.
it does. It has to
Does
go to
it?
the floor.
Has-
But that's okay.
I was told
Look,
differently then.
listen, if this is the will of the group, I would support interim study, as long as it's not the polite death, okay?
Yeah, no, I definitely want to have another study, at least if for no other reason, for the purpose of formulating either an amendment, a proper amendment. And my personal feeling is I just don't think there's enough evidence to stay with the distance factor as stated. There might be a compromise here somewhere. I don't know. And the
Right.
registry, I think we're going to have.
But I would support it
go away.
if the goal of the let's not call it study, this continuation of this discussion is basically what we're talking about. I think you find members who are, I'm sure you can find at least 7 members or more that would be interested in continuing this conversation.
Oh,
I
they're
would, and
always
I'm
invited
gonna,
to be
what I'm
here.
gonna suggest is that what CC Doucette just I'll hand it out to you, each have a copy for each one of you. This may be a good starting point as to what can we do? Because yes, we all are all up against the 1996 Telecommunication Act. We know that. It became a question to me whether New Hampshire was bold enough to take on the federal government. And I was going to see what would happen here if I was going to go to the governor and say, would you even sign this? And because realizing that we would have to take on the federal government, because that'll cost the state money to battle that out. But I think here with this, what's here is a good starting point for the discussion of how do we craft this so that we can keep our citizens safer, ability to empower our municipalities more within the structure of maybe a better approach. And I can see the writing on the wall. That's why I'm saying what I'm saying here. Yes, there's a lot of open questions. It takes a while to absorb all this information, and again, I've concluded in my mind some of the concerns are very real, but I think there's some things we can do as a state that would not put us at loggerheads with the federal government. And we could go at loggerheads. There were some openings because of the court cases that I mentioned, and there are future court cases coming up that are going to hopefully expose this whole thing for what it is. But for the time being, if it's an interim study, and if we really, and I'd love to join you in that effort. And I can bring any experts you want. The other side can bring experts that you want. And Representative Notter, we gave CTIA every opportunity to bring in as many witnesses as they wanted to. They brought in one fellow from the University of Swanson, from University of Pittsburgh, who was clearly paid big money to be there, and did not give us any studies to the reverse of it. You know, it was unbelievable. All the other people, we gave them a chance, and I said to her, I said to, I'm losing her name now, Bet Cooley, I said, give us your best shot. Bring in more people. I want to hear from them, you know, and they didn't produce anybody else. You know, it isn't like we didn't try. We did try to bring in more of the other side. And that's why we purposely in the bill, we stated we wanted industry people there, just so we can have that real true dialogue on this. And I hope when we continue the discussion in the interim study that the industry does produce some people. But, you know, anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
But I'm
So-
going to hand these out before you
Right.
leave.
Just so
Thank
some
you.
people here understand, my understanding, if we as a subcommittee here vote to recommend interim study, and our committee votes to have interim study, that will result in a study, but the results from the interim study will only produce a recommendation of what could be submitted as a bill in the next biennium. So you'll have to wait another cycle for anything to happen. So that's how that works. Yes, and I think this is a situation where I think it's well worth having additional study, like I said, for no other reason but to formulate a proper wording for either an amendment or a new bill or whatever we want to recommend on that. I think we don't have enough time right now to write something for next week.
Can another parliamentary question. If this was amended and went to the floor, could we recommend tabling, and then if we wanted to use the rest of this season, bring it back off the table?
The tabling
It's
is
just another,
right. Tabling is an option. I think if it's done, I forget the timeline, but there's a certain timeline where you'd have to have a 2/3 majority to take it off the table. I don't think we're there yet, but it's possible. You answer that question only?
What happens after crossover, then it's going to take a 2/3 vote to get it off the table, which will be hard to do.
Right. I would also recommend that if we go into that, we try to get the ear of some senators to find out what their thoughts might be on that, because it would help. Yes, Representative Platt.
Yes,
Good to see you.
I'm not on the committee, so I
That's
kept
right.
my mouth shut through most of this, but.
And you don't play one on TV either, do you?
Yeah. What's that?
You don't play one on TV either, do you?
What?
Be on the committee, a rep.
Anyway, it crossed my mind when
One
the
year ago.
discussion of table came up, is that this is an early bill. And so you have to do something with it. That's
Okay.
all.
Okay. My apologies. I knew there were some bills out there that were FNs that we had that were not early bills. I'd forgotten this one was, so it's an important bill, though. Representative Marshall.
I could be very much in favor of interim study if that's what the majority of us feel. However, my concern with interim study is that the FCC has already asserted its authority in this area. And without something like this intervening, could we expect them to continue to assert their authority?
Well, with no action being done right now, the industry will forge ahead, I'm sure.
Okay, that's my only concern with
Right.
an interim study as opposed to an OTP.
we don't have timelines from the industry. What does rollout mean? There is some 5G around. You know, we really don't know that. And is it within the next 6 months? I probably think so, within the next six months to a year. But we don't have any information like that. That's really crucial.
That's true. And even if we did recommend OTPA, and even if we voted recommendation OTPA, and even if it did pass the House, it would still have to wait and go to the Senate and go through their deliberation, and it's possible they could not approve it, or if they did, you still have until at least, June at least, before it got to the governor's desk, and then there's a possibility of whether it would be signed or not. So the time limit is far down the future anyway, so while that's going on, there's nothing to prevent the industry from forging ahead with what they're doing.
But there's also nothing to prevent the industry, which really makes me distraught, from coming and talking to us and sitting down and truly discussing this, not just in a pub, but discussing this with us, like we called stakeholders together before and understood what was going on and what their timelines were and what our timelines were, and are there any compromise? You know, maybe the 1,600 feet is too much. Maybe, is there any way we can compromise on this? And what are their plans?
Right. Well, that was one reason why I was sort of suggesting if we wanted to meet again this week and invite them here for another subcommittee meeting. But if that's not really possible for our subcommittee, the interim study, we would certainly invite them to come and implore them to come. I think we have some representatives here that hopefully will get that message back to them anyway. Yes, Representative Dotter.
Well, a couple of things. I'm curious to know if there are other states that are talking about blocking 5G, and if not, why does New Hampshire have to be the first one? And also, can I make an official motion to recommend interim study?
Are we done discussing? Let's have an answer to the question first, and then I will ask for a motion.
Thank you. Yes, Massachusetts has 20 bills to address technology safety. Your commission bill is being replicated. New York has 2 bills that does a lot of what you guys already did here. So you guys are the leaders in the country, but many other states are doing this. I was brought in on a panel in Michigan. And if you go to my personal research repository, which is in my signature on the communiques I've been sending to you, go to Understanding EMFs. I have a page in there for bills in other states, and you can see what other states are doing. And thank you for being the first to take meaningful action. You're leading the way.
If I may ask, could you send could you send the entire committee all either links or documents as to what you just said, so we could see what's happening in the rest of the country?
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you, and the sooner the better. Thank you.
Sure.
Well, right now, I'll be asking for a motion in a second. Do we have questions, Representative Partial?
Again, I don't want to prolong conversation here, but what would happen if we thus adjourned for the day? We will be hearing testimony in another week. Could we carve out 2 minutes of time to take an in-person vote on this? But in the interim, use that time to look at more closely at this material and maybe have a lively conversation through some other process, internet or something. I don't know if that's possible. I'm asking.
Actually, that is a very good suggestion. We could do that. I mean, it wouldn't take more than 45 seconds for us to go through a motion after we hear the rest of the public testimony. It probably wouldn't be a bad idea to hear the rest of the public testimony. How does the rest of the subcommittee feel about that? I would approach the chair and say we need to carve out 5 minutes prior to opening up executive session for the subcommittee to vote for a recommendation that we could bring forth during the executive session.
I know this it cuts into everybody's lunchtime, but why not even a half hour? Meet at 12:30. We're going to have a public hearing at 1, which I don't know how well attended it will be, but maybe some of the people from the industry might show up and say something meaningful.
I'm sorry, were you suggesting that we have
that we have at least a half an hour before the opening of the public hearing?
Who's we, the subcommittee?
The subcommittee.
And so is it your intent to take a vote before the public hearing or after the public hearing?
I would say that we should take a vote after the public hearing, but 5 minutes, because then you're going into an executive session at 2.
Okay, so your recommendation would be for us to come back as a subcommittee at 12:30 on the 7th to have a little more discussion, open up the public hearing, hear additional public hearing, and then before executive session starts, we can have a vote on what we want to recommend. But the public hearing does have to start at 2, just so that you know. I mean, the executive session, a public hearing has to start at 1, just so you have. An executive session can start anytime afterwards, really. After 2, that is. You know, it can't start before 2, but anytime after that, I think. What do you think? Well, if it's up to me, then let's do that. Let's schedule the next subcommittee meeting at 12:30 on the 7th. I think we have to announce it. Does that give us time on the 7th, though? That would come out that would come out next Thursday, right? Yeah, and that would give us time. All right? Are we all in favor of that? We don't have to take a vote, but okay. Next subcommittee meeting, I will schedule it for 12:30 on the 7th, and a vote to follow after public hearing on 1644 ends. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Thank you here. Thank you for coming. A lot of good information to be passed on. Science is never ending. Science is never settled. We always have to go through testing. So thank you for your information. Thank you. Subcommittee is closed.
I don't have that little point that you sent out, a little Reader's Digest version of the report. I don't have that either.
That was on, I handed those out in the last hearing. Well, it's the first 37 pages of the report. I'm gonna send you the whole report.
Yeah, I need to go into that report.
It should be upstairs in research, shouldn't it? Shouldn't it be upstairs in research?
Yeah, ask anybody, they'll find it for you. They'll send it to you.
They should have it.
You know Jen? Do you know Jen? Jennifer? On the 4th floor?
No, I used to go there all the time.
She was the research, she had, yeah, any of them can find it.
Here's the report. But there's a copy file. There's a copy file. He's a copy of another research.
Yeah, it's fine, yeah.
Institutional knowledge is not bad.
Nick, I'm going to need you to have you write up some words of what happened.
I didn't speak.
Did I ask you to fill out this sheet?
Yeah. So I'd be able to chime in at public hearing, last public hearing. So I thought that it would be more appropriate to jump up on this one. Hi, how are you? And have the full hearing here, what I have to say. So,
Yeah, because I was curious. I wanted to ask that.
yeah, so I'll save the comments till then.